David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So over the weekend, we continued to learn more about the truth and the falsity of what has been circulating about Robert Mueller's report that he sent to Attorney General William Barr last Sunday. And one of the bits of information we've learned is that the Mueller report, meaning the summary of the investigation, is more than 300 pages long, more than 350 pages long, according to some, and reportedly 400 pages long, according to a document which we will look at in the next segment. This immediately raises the obvious questions that I've been bringing up for a week now, the most obvious of which is, how much can we really know about what's in a 350 or 400 page report on the basis of a political 4-page summary? The answer is very, very little. There's a New York Times report and there's a Politico report, which are bringing up more important questions we still don't know the answers to. One of those questions is, will Congress ever get an unredacted full version of the report? Some say yes, some say no. We don't really know. How many pages of underlying evidence and case files are there? There's one guesstimate which says it's several 100,000, if not more than 1 million pages of underlying evidence and case files, which Mueller summarized into 300 to 400 pages, which Barr summarized into 4 pages. Will or won't Donald Trump's lawyers get a chance to redact some version of the report? Conflicting evidence about that and conflicting assertions, which we've been talking about. When William Barr said last week, according to Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, that he would be releasing a version of the report, which version is that? What is implicit about what will be missing from a version or that version versus the entire thing? So this is merely the beginning of this fight. The Justice Department or Trump's lawyers, again, we don't really know the truth about who gets to do what now. Either of them might try to claim executive privilege to get portions of the report redacted. The House of Representatives, Democrats in the House, that is, will almost definitely question that assertion of privilege, and that will become a legal fight. And one of the primary questions is, if Mueller's 300 to 400 page report can't exonerate Donald Trump from obstruction, which was like one of the few quotes that Barr actually included in his 4-page letter, how is it that William Barr was able to so quickly say that there's no obstruction, and why is it barely even mentioned in his 4-page letter? And of course, we know the answer. I told you the answer last week, which is that the Barr report is a political document. It's not a law enforcement document. It's not, now Barr is even walking back, that it's a full summary, and we'll get to that in the next segment. And by the way, when I say more than 300 pages, a couple of people, including Fox News Judge Andrew Napolitano, claim the report itself is 700 pages. The source is unclear. But needless to say, we're talking about a 300 to 400 page report here. The 9/11 Commission report was more than 550 pages. The Clinton Special Counsel report was 445 pages. As an interesting sort of point of contrast, the Watergate report was under 100 pages, and we know what that led to, meaning even a short report can contain significant evidence of criminality. Bottom line, we still don't know what Mueller's full conclusions were. We don't know what evidence Robert Mueller gathered in those possibly 1 million+ pages of evidence and case files. The one thing, and I guess this is a good thing, that Americans seem to be able to agree on is that they want the full report. We have a Quinnipiac poll from last week that I told you about. 85% of Americans, 84 maybe, want to see the full Mueller report. That means that it's most Republicans, it's most Democrats, it's most independents, all want to see the report. Will we ever see what we could call a full report with only the absolutely necessary redactions? I actually have no idea at this point in time. The initial deadline for a version to go to Congress is tomorrow, April 2nd. I'll follow up with you tomorrow about it. I couldn't tell you what it is that we might or might not see this week. Okay, so now let's get into the Barr walkback, as I'm calling it. Exactly as I've been saying for a week now, Donald Trump's Attorney General William Barr is now saying that his 4-page summary of the Mueller report isn't actually a summary of the full investigation. It was just, as I told you, some things that he chose to say. Last week, I started referring to what Barr published as a supposed summary of Mueller's summary of the investigation. As I told you in the last story on today's show, we now know that the Mueller summary of the full investigation is 300 to 400 pages long. It's an investigation that could have 1 million or more pages of investigative data, evidence, testimony, and more documents. It obviously became untenable to maintain that these 4 measly pages from William Barr could respectably be called a summary of the full investigation. So what William Barr did, it's really very clever. He snuck into a letter that he put out over this weekend that his 4-page letter last weekend is not actually a summary of the investigation. And this has barely gotten any attention, but it's so important. I want to go through the documents and the articles with you. CNN Justice Department correspondent Laura Jarrett published this latest letter from William Barr on her Twitter account. And this is just amazing because most of the reporting on this letter that we're showing you is about when will the report ultimately be released? And Barr lists a whole bunch of different things that need to be retracted, things that are classified, all these categories of things named by William Barr that need to be retracted. But if you look closely at the bottom of the first page, you will see William Barr say, my March 24 letter, Barr now specifically calling it, it's just a letter, that's all it is, not a summary, not a report, it's just a letter. My March 24 letter was not and did not purport to be an exhaustive recounting of the special counsel's investigation or report. As my letter made clear, my notification to Congress and the public provided, pending the release of the report, a summary of its principal conclusions. That is what he considers to be the bottom line. And he goes on to say, quote, I do not believe it would be in the public's interest for me to attempt to summarize the full report or to release it in serial or piecemeal fashion. That's right. We know that. And now he's saying it, and he's right. The document does not call itself a summary per se. It's a list of what William Barr says are the most relevant conclusions. But despite William Barr now saying this 7 days after he released this thing, Trumpists and corporate media and right-wing media and even some left-wing media claimed utter and complete exoneration on the basis of this letter being a summary of the entire report. The transparency of this 4-page letter as a political document is very, very clear. This is a walk back, but a calculated one. Barr never actually says everything that's in the report is here. What he said is the important things from the report are in this letter. That is used for a week by the 24-hour news cycle to claim that this is it. This is vindication. This means there's no evidence of obstruction. This is a total clear vindication of Donald Trump and everybody around him. And then William Barr says, listen, that was just what I thought of as the principal conclusions. That was never actually meant to be a summary, but the cat is out of the bag. The horses have left the stable, so to speak here. And what we now recognize as effectively a press release from William Barr a week and a day ago of 4 pages was merely a pretext for Donald Trump and his cronies to claim exoneration. And this is, the thing about it, Pat, it worked. I mean, they're not stupid, okay? Trump picked Barr specifically to manage the release of this report. Barr did exactly what he was supposed to do, which is put out a political document that is a pretext for Sean Hannity and Jeanine Pirro and Trump Jr. and everybody to say, it's over, folks, no collusion T-shirts and hats and whatever else. And now we actually have to try to walk back the misunderstandings, which they deliberately calculated and planned. Congratulations to them. I mean, they did it.
Right. I think William Barr has successfully primed the pump on this. And you have to wonder, why did we even need his summary to begin with? Like, I understand he wanted to put out the initial conclusions and he wanted to make sure that we had some understanding of what went on with the Mueller report because it was a matter of public interest. And also, if the president was indeed compromised by Russia, we'd want to know that as soon as possible. But we waited 1.5 years, 2 years for this investigation to end. I think we could wait a few more weeks to actually see the Mueller report itself. We don't need William Barr's summary.
Consider for a second, if Democrats didn't control the House of Representatives right now, we might never get the truth. I mean, we still might not. By the way, we don't know ultimately what it is that we're going to get. Hopefully we will get it. But if Democrats didn't control the House, there is no chance that we're getting it. And key point, as I said, this is not a document summarizing the probe. It's a press release, PR-friendly, cheerleading document meant specifically to serve as the pretext for Trump to claim victory, go around the country claiming victory, which he did, and it worked on lots of Americans. A lot of the individuals are pretty dim-witted that are involved here, but the big picture of this scam was executed very, very well. And I guess in some sense, I mean, it's disgusting, but I've got to give them credit. They actually pulled it off. Let me know what you think. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman, and the show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Eric Gramsammer on a very special April 1st, April Fool's Day, as some of the kids these days say. Eric Gramsammer, a new member of the day. Also want to say thanks to Conrado de la Garza, who is our long-term sustaining member of the day. He's been with us for nearly 5 years of membership. Join Eric and Conrado by supporting our show directly. No middlemen, no middle women, nothing in the middle. Other than, of course, that 3% payment processing fee. 97% of membership payments go directly to the show. You can sign up at www.joinpakman.com. Okay, it's really important to understand how very coherent and well-executed narratives have been crafted by Donald Trump and the people around him about the Mueller report. I know at the end of last segment I mentioned that they really set this entire thing up very, very astutely. And I want to dig into that a little bit more now. I'm praising Donald Trump and his team here because this is actually evil genius. I'm not being sarcastic. I'm not being sardonic. I don't like it. I don't think it's good for the country. I don't think it's good for people who care about truth and reality. But they are doing a textbook job of building a narrative that is sticking with his supporters and even with some centrists and leftists. All along, as we waited for the Mueller report, Trump insisted there was no collusion. His attorneys, like Rudy Giuliani, went on TV and radio, and they sort of set expectations that this could be bad. They don't think Trump truly did anything wrong, but the report could be really damaging to Trump, even though I've been telling you for more than a year, the chances of Mueller saying Trump personally colluded with Russia are, to quote myself from a year ago, almost zero. So then when the report comes out, we knew that they would be able to say, this is it? This is everything? What a waste of time this entire investigation has been. In the midst of all this, as they're waiting for the report, Trump seeks out and finds the perfect attorney general to put in to manage the report, William Barr, who doesn't even believe at a fundamental level that a president can be charged with obstruction. I mean, it's like perfect. They're doing everything right. The report comes out. Mueller's summary of the report is 300 to 400 pages, as we learned over the weekend. That's delivered to William Barr. And William Barr puts out a letter in 4 pages just perfectly fomenting the narrative for Trump and his cronies. They cherry pick pieces, including mostly things that are advantageous to Trump, excluding the vast majority of the report, using legalese that's sometimes confusing and sometimes contradictory, as I pointed out last week. And that bogus letter, in the absence of the actual report from Robert Mueller, which now they're going out of their way to hide from being published in full, becomes the basis for Donald Trump and his kids and Fox News and Rush Limbaugh and right-wing media to do the victory lap that they've been doing. They do the exoneration world tour. They're printing T-shirts that say no collusion. Trump's calling into TV shows about it. And remember, all of this is based on William Barr's bogus letter, which I said a year ago was never going to say Trump personally colluded. And we have now learned, according to William Barr himself, was not even really meant to be a comprehensive summary of the investigation. That gets us to this weekend. Donald Trump, on his victory tour, went to Grand Rapids, Michigan, and within 90 seconds of starting his speech, lies and says that the report found no obstruction. Now, the one of the very few quotes from Mueller's actual summary that William Barr included in his letter was that Robert Mueller cannot exonerate Donald Trump from obstruction. And yet, here's Donald Trump in the first minute and a half of his victory speech at Grand Rapids, Michigan.
The special counsel completed its report and found no collusion and no obstruction.
That is a lie. That's a lie. I mean, there's no other way to say it. We don't know what the underlying evidence is, but even Barr's report admits that Trump was not exonerated from collusion. Mueller was not able to exonerate Donald Trump from collusion, but it doesn't matter. They've played this perfectly. And as I said last Monday, unless something changes, Donald Trump is quickly accelerating towards re-election in 2020. And I mean, you know, we joke around, Pat. Sometimes people call in, they say, David, can you name things that you agree with Donald Trump with? And I have like a couple minor things that I happen to agree with him on. This is not that I agree with him, but I can't say anything other than they've played this really, really well.
Yeah, really well, especially putting Attorney General William Barr in there. They had the time to do it because the investigation took a long time. Also, Trump lies all the time, so it's not like the media is going to report on this specific lie. Furthermore, Trump supporters aren't going to fact check Trump. They're not going to read the 4-page summary or letter for themselves. So he's able to get away with it. And then ultimately, obstruction of justice is supposed to be something taken up by Congress, not by the Attorney General. So if we get the full report and Democrats decide they do want to take up Trump on obstruction of justice, try to impeach him, then it's going to be seen by many as the witch hunt that Trump called it in the first place. Like, this has already been litigated. The DOJ has already exonerated Trump for obstruction of justice. Why is Congress looking into it? So they have definitely played it perfectly.
No question about it. And okay, I mean, now what? I mean, the Mueller grand jury actually is continuing. A lot of people don't know that. There may well be more indictments. The Trump financial fraud cases continue. The fraud also continues, I would argue. Trying to get Trump's taxes continues. Southern District of New York continues. But I say forget about it. I mean, let them do their work. Something might come from it, but none of those things are 2020 strategies. I'm going to talk about that in the next segment with David Faris. Democrats need to put together a strong platform and a winning candidate. And so far, I'm not feeling any confidence that that is what Democrats are doing for the time being. So let it all continue to happen. But you've got to start dealing seriously with how are you going to defeat Trump in 2020? Because that's the most direct path to actually removing him from the White House, as I've been saying now for a long time. There's a wacky and ridiculous headline that appeared on screen on Fox News that's obviously really dumb, but it's actually also a serious thing that I want to talk about with you, which is the total misunderstanding of Latin America that exists. These lower third images matter that show up at the bottom. When you tune into MSNBC or CNN or Fox News, even before you listen to what's being said to figure out what the topic is, to see if you're interested, you often will just read what's at the bottom of the screen, the lower third, as it's often called. And when Donald Trump over the weekend announced that he was going to be cutting aid to 3 Latin American countries, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, these are 3 countries, right? This is not Mexico. These are 3 other countries. Fox News erroneously, inadvertently wrote the headline that Donald Trump cuts aid to 3 Mexican countries. That's what it said on screen. Trump cuts U.S. aid to 3 Mexican countries. So yes, ha, 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 they don't know geography. They don't know about Latin America. These are countries that many people come to the U.S. from. So they are Mexican through Mexico. So they are Mexican countries. Fine. It's nonsense. And Fox News apologized for it. And then they corrected it. But there's actually a really deep thing that I want to talk about. And this is the perfect opportunity to talk about it. And there's a sort of geopolitical side. And then there's a personal side, which I'll tell you about this. So first, the geopolitical. Lots of Americans don't know about all of these Latin American countries. When they think about immigration, they sort of imagine people from this mess of countries below Mexico. It's people who are basically just like Mexicans. They speak Spanish, who most importantly are trying to invade the United States through the southern border. So it doesn't really matter if they're coming from Guatemala or Honduras or Costa Rica, Panama, or Venezuela, or wherever. And of course, they're only coming from some of these countries in any significant numbers. In the same way that they don't care to know or understand the differences between like single payer versus Medicare for all, versus a nationalized healthcare system. It's all communism in the minds of many people. They don't care or know the differences between what's happening in Mexico versus what's happening in Honduras versus Guatemala, or the fact that these countries have different indigenous groups, each of whom have different cultures and different histories and very often speak different languages in addition to Spanish. And they definitely have no idea that the United States' relationships to these countries in the last 100 years has been drastically different. If you consider the U.S. history in Nicaragua, for example, to the U.S. history with Costa Rica and Mexico as an example, there is very little in common other than, a bunch of the people in these countries speak Spanish. So in a sense, the stupid headline of Trump is cutting aid to 3 Mexican countries, it's more accurate than you can imagine in terms of the worldview that exists for many of these right-wingers and Trumpists. So that's on the geopolitical side. Now, on the personal, individual sort of identity politics side, even relatively educated people are very confused about Latin America. I have this funny anecdote where someone I know has family, has cousins who live in a rural conservative part of the United States. And there was a point in time where the cousins were sort of confused. They somehow heard David speaks Spanish. Oh, I speak Spanish. Yeah, David speaks Spanish. He's from Argentina. And they said, oh, he's Mexican? Wait, he speaks Spanish? He's Mexican? No, he's from Argentina. That's a different country. It's in South America, not in Central America. Lots of countries speak Spanish. Mexican is a nationality. Oh, but isn't David's white, right? Yeah, that's right. He is white, and his ethnicity is Ashkenazi Jewish, but you can be from any country and speak any language. And then it was, wait, there are Jews in Mexico? And the answer is, of course, there are Jews in Mexico, but David's not from Mexico. David's from Argentina. So the stupid headline is, sadly, I wish it weren't the case. I wish we could just laugh it off as some dumb thing on Fox News. It actually is a really good opportunity to point out that there are a lot of understandings out there about Latin America. And in the same way that many people in the West see that jumble of countries when you look at a map of Africa as not particularly distinct, and only when you actually inform yourself do you realize about countries that where French is spoken, that are very distinct from other parts of Africa, Northern and Southern Africa, West Africa, and all of these different conflicts and sort of internal politics. There's a very similar sort of perspective with Latin and South America, and it doesn't make any sense. And this stupid headline on Fox News, as dumb as it is, actually is sort of opening the door to a lot of that. So I'm kind of glad to have the opportunity to discuss it, because I don't know how else I would kind of randomly bring it up. But anyway, Fox News, they apologized, and who knows who they blamed. It doesn't even matter at this point, some kind of error in the control room, as they often say. But that is actually the perspective of many people when they hear that these 3 countries are no longer getting aid from the United States. What they imagine is, these are all countries where people just come in over the U.S.-Mexico border. Let's cut aid to all of them until they do what we want. And what that is, never exactly clear when you hear Trump say they're not even doing anything for us. Make sure you're following the show on Instagram at David Pakman Show. We will take a quick break. Next, I will be joined by David Faris, and we will talk about, are Democrats fighting dirty, to use the term that he used in terms of encouraging how Democrats should behave last time he was on. Are they fighting dirty yet, or are they not? David Faris joins me next.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to welcome back to the program today David Faris, who's an associate professor of political science at Roosevelt University, also author of It's Time to Fight Dirty, How Democrats Can Build a Lasting Majority in American Politics. Great to have you back on, David, first of all.
Great to be on the show. Thanks for having me again.
So last time you were on, we talked about some of the things that Democrats could do that you feel would improve their electoral chances. We talked about areas in which Democrats have historically, or at least recently, not performed particularly well in terms of campaign and political strategy. What are you starting to see now as the 2020 primary gets going and we have a number of candidates, many with different approaches and political views? Is anyone in particular doing something right or wrong? And bigger picture, how is this Democratic primary shaping up at a sort of higher level?
Sure. So I've been really happy to see sort of several of the candidates talking about procedural reform. So you have, people like Elizabeth Warren and Pete Buttigieg talking about eliminating the filibuster, which is that's like the gateway drug for Democrats to be able to do anything if they get back into power, because there's almost no way that we're getting to 60 seats after 2020. I'd say there is no way, right? So if we sit around waiting for 7 or 8 Republican votes for the things that we want to do, whether that's Medicare for all or whether that's comprehensive immigration reform, we're going to be very disappointed and we're going to waste our time in office. So the filibuster stuff is quickly becoming almost a kind of a litmus test in the Democratic primary field, and I'm really happy to see that.
Now, that's interesting. I mean, let's talk about that briefly, because as much as I agree with you about the importance of it strategically, empirically, in terms of passing legislation, is that a voting issue? Like, is that going to be a voting issue both within the primary and in the general election?
I don't think in the general election, no, but I think in the primary, I think that there are a large group of committed activists who want to hear our candidates at least say that they're willing to entertain the idea of doing away with the filibuster. I don't think they have to go out and say, like, I'm going to do this on day one. But I think you saw, like, Cory Booker, who went on Pod Save America and said, I'd really like to get cooperation from Republicans. And he had to walk that back. And so it looks to me like there's a slice of the primary electorate that wants to hear how our candidates will address the structural issues in the Senate. And the best way to do that is to eliminate the filibuster and have kind of simple majority rule like they do on every other legislature on earth.
Okay, fair point. I would still assert that a lot of the even Democratic primary voting public doesn't really know much about Senate procedure, for better or worse, and I
Sure.
think that that's sort of borne out by the polling. So now moving on to what we might agree as more preeminent voting issues, how do you think the conversation is shaping up in the primary?
I think that all of the candidates are on board with the reform that was passed out of the House. That's H.R. 1, and that does things like, restore the voting rights of ex-felons. It does things like expand automatic voter registration. It has a procedure. I don't think it goes far enough, but it has a procedure to address voter ID laws in a way that they have a tendency to suppress Democratic votes. So in terms of voting rights, I think basically everyone in the primary field is on board with what the House wants to do. I obviously like to see them go a little bit further with a couple of those things, but I think it's a reasonable starting point to open that conversation. And I think that there's real momentum building for things like DC and Puerto Rico statehood, which would also really help the balance of power in the Senate. And I expect that to become sort of more like the filibuster in the sense that it becomes a litmus test for our candidates in the primary, and the sort of the most active and engaged voters in the Democratic primary will want to hear that our candidates are on board with those kinds of things.
So sticking with 2020, but now starting to shift to Democrats in the House and what might be available to them now that they have been sworn in as a majority in the House. The Mueller report news, which, of course, as my audience knows, is the Barr summary of the Mueller summary of the Mueller investigation, right, which is what we have so far. How, if at all, should this be discussed by the 2020 candidates, and who's doing it right, who's doing it wrong, if anybody, so far?
What I hear from the candidates really generally is, what I think makes sense, which is that we have not seen the Mueller report, and that we're going to wait to make any judgments about actions based on the report until we've seen it. And so right now, I think what they're doing is they're trying to put pressure on the Attorney General to make sure that he releases a report that has as few redactions as possible and doesn't make any effort to cover up the president's wrongdoing. I think that the voters in general are not as engaged with this issue as those of us who have been thinking about it for 2 years might be.
Yes.
I think the polling bears out the contention that that the whole Trump-Russia scandal is not. It doesn't make a top 5 list, or maybe even a top 10 list of the voters' concerns. And so I'd be reluctant to see our primary candidates pushing the Russia scandal too heavily. But that's not to say that I don't think our elected officials in Congress should not be doing everything that they can in terms of their oversight powers to bring any wrongdoing to light, to follow up with hearings, and to really keep the heat on the president as much as possible. Because as much as voters may not see this as a top-tier issue, the flip side of that is that actually gives Democrats in Congress a lot of wiggle room to be aggressive with the scandal and to be aggressive with the president's personal dealings and business dealings prior to and after he took office as president.
Yeah, I mean, my approach from a while ago, and I spent a lovely part of last week pulling old clips just to re-communicate to my audience that my position has been it's the chances of Donald Trump personally being caught criminally conspiring to collude as an individual were always almost zero. There were questions as to what specifically would be proven, but that either way, it's not a campaign platform to run on impeachment, to run on anything related to the investigation, to run on removal under the 25th Amendment. And that's where my concern is now growing, that there is not, beyond the fact that, yes, Bernie Sanders has mainstreamed a lot of ideas that in 2016 were more rare within the Democratic Party. That's a really good thing, and I like to see that. I'm worried that there is not sort of like a robust new platform that has changed drastically from what Bernie was talking about in 2016, which, yes, more candidates now are behind. Do you disagree? I mean, what would you point to as the pillars of the 2020 sort of discussion that's taking place now?
Well, I mean, I think, you saw the president this week sort of endorse yet again repealing the entirety of the Affordable Care Act,
right?
Which is just mind-boggling to me, because I think that position, the Republican position on healthcare, cost Republicans the Senate. I mean, the House. And so I think that healthcare is going to be front and center in 2020. And I think there's a lot of space for the different candidates to hash out exactly what their position is on expanding access to healthcare and reducing costs. I think you'll see a pretty clear split between candidates endorsing Medicare for all or some version of Medicare for all, and then candidates who might take a more centrist approach. And that will play out as the primary unfolds. Beyond that, I would like to see some more policy innovation, or at least some more substantive policy discussions taking place. And I do think that'll happen when the debates start and the candidates start fleshing out, where they stand on various things. I think Democrats really need an immigration plan, like a positive immigration plan. So, we've spent several years, criticizing the president's policies here and the Republican Party's policies. But what do we stand for, right? Beyond, we don't want kids in cages, and beyond, we want to slow the pace of deportations and maybe reform ICE or abolish ICE. But what is the plan for sort of taking this issue off the table moving forward? Like, how do we do right by all of the undocumented immigrants who are here? What is the system that we want to put into place, and how do we communicate that to voters? Because the president, as we know, I think is going to run on immigration. There's no question in my mind. And while I don't think that worked for him in the midterms in the House, we can't sort of discount the possibility that it could be a powerful issue for him and his base moving into 2020. And I think Democrats need to have more than opposition to the president's position on immigration. I think we need concrete plans for that.
So last time you were on, we talked about packing the courts. You've mentioned D.C. and Puerto Rican statehood. There's these ideas about splitting up California in a way that would be potentially advantageous to Democrats. Let's talk just about the period between now and when the next Congress is sworn in January of 2021. What do you want to see Democrats do now that they can actually do, that would not just be these sort of symbolic moves? Well,
Democrats have very limited power to enact any legislation on things related to the Supreme Court or things related to D.C. and Puerto Rico statehood. I do think that they really should pass statehood bills for D.C. and Puerto Rico in this Congress. In other words, debate them, pass them out of the House. We know that they will die on Mitch McConnell's desk, but I think that there's still real value in demonstrating to the voters what a Democratic Congress would look like and the kinds of laws that a Democratic president would sign if we have a Democratic Congress and a Democratic president.
That's
So,
interesting. So sometimes my audience says, what's the point in wasting time with these symbolic votes that aren't going to pass? They look at the 60-something votes that Republicans did on repealing the Affordable Care Act, when obviously that wasn't going to get through at most. President Obama obviously would have vetoed it if it could even get through the Senate. You're saying one of the benefits of doing that is you are signaling that if you vote a particular way in the Senate and for the presidency next time around, this is the type of stuff that could actually pass. They're not just talking about it, they're actually doing it in the House.
Exactly, yeah. And I don't mean pass it 30 times every time, McConnell doesn't touch it. I think that you pass each of those bills once, and then you run on it in the same way that they're doing with H.R. 1. So with the voting reform bill, and it's also got anti-corruption elements and stuff about lobbying. Obviously that's not going to become law before 2021. We know that Mitch McConnell immediately sabotaged the whole thing in a WAPO op-ed and said, I'm not going to bring it to the floor because I don't have to. And that's probably what he's going to do with all legislation related to these Democratic priorities. But that doesn't mean that H.R. 1 did not have real value, right? Because we are now talking about things like a national election holiday. We're talking about restoring rights nationally to ex-felons. And I think that has real value because it offers to the Democratic primary candidates, and then whoever the general election candidate ends up being, they can point to that and say, like, look, the day that I come into office, I'm going to sign H.R. 1. The day that I come into office, I'm going to sign a bill granting statehood to Washington, D.C. And, you and I know that nothing happens on day one. But it's something that could be a month one priority for the next Democratic administration. And you wouldn't have to waste a bunch of time running these bills through committees and debating them and giving the opposition time to formulate a response, right? You just come in, you say, we already have the legislation. I told you I was going to sign this. Here I am. Here's my pen, and I'm signing it. And I think it'll give a real momentum to the early period of that next Democratic presidency, which is so crucial in proving to the voters that you are going to pursue the priorities that you told the voters you would pursue during the campaign.
Last thing, to just touch on 2020 one more time before we wrap up. Are there any candidates in particular that, on the basis of what you've outlined in the book, are most closely adhering to the sort of tactics and strategy that you recommend?
Yeah, I think there's two candidates that have been pretty aggressive about this stuff on the trail so far. One is Elizabeth Warren, who has endorsed DC statehood. She's talked about the filibuster in ways that are really interesting. There was this long quote in an interview with her where she said, we can't just let Republicans violate these norms and then we come in and say that we're going to play by the old rules, right? Like that will no longer apply if I'm president. And she didn't say, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, but the implicit threat there was very real. And then Pete Buttigieg, who, I think was not really on anybody's radar a couple of months ago, has had a very successful rollout in which one of the ways he's distinguished himself from the field is saying, yeah, I will entertain the idea of adding justices to the Supreme Court. And while that's not, I think, a winning general election plan, and I don't necessarily think he should run on it per se, I do think communicating to a certain segment of the Democratic primary electorate that you are willing to be extremely aggressive procedurally in exactly the way the Republicans have been, that to me is a good message and a good way for somebody who doesn't have much name recognition nationally to distinguish himself from the rest of the field. So those are the two that I think are being most aggressive about it so far. I'm happy to see them saying all of these things. I hope that they are paired with a robust progressive agenda. I'm more confident of that with Warren than I am of Buttigieg because we haven't really seen him take positions on all these policy ideas, whereas Warren has this incredible policy shop with a number of really cool ideas, not stuff from my book, but ways of reforming the way that capitalism works in America that I think are really interesting. So I'm looking forward to hearing more from both of them as well as all the other candidates when the debates get going.
The book is It's Time to Fight Dirty, How Democrats Can Build a Lasting Majority in American Politics. We've been speaking with the book's author, David Faris, who's an associate professor of political science at Roosevelt University. David, thanks for coming back on today.
Oh, it was a great time. Anytime.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Fox News host Chris Wallace has enraged the Fox News audience by sort of piercing their narrative about no collusion, no obstruction. The entire Mueller probe was a witch hunt, started with a bogus dossier talking point. We've debated before on the show how much value there is in having these occasional voices of reason on Fox News. And the argument usually goes, on the one hand, it's good when Chris Wallace or Shep Smith or whoever say something that's just kind of an uncontroversial truth in most of the world on Fox News, because it will kind of awaken their audience to the reality that there are other perspectives on what the Trump administration is doing, and that's a good thing. The counter argument is that when you have occasionally Shep Smith or Chris Wallace say some grain of truth on Fox News, it kind of provides cover to Fox News to be able to say, we're fair and balanced, we have a diversity of views, we have Chris Wallace and Shep Smith, see, we're doing it, we're fair and balanced. And the reality is that even when Chris Wallace or Shep Smith say some basic truth about the Trump administration, they're not challenging the sort of propaganda corporate media status quo and may even help to sort of reinforce it. But my position historically has been, I think it's a net positive. It's a net positive despite being maybe a small one, to occasionally pierce the narrative of Fox News viewers with someone there who will tell some minor truth. So that gets us to Chris Wallace over the weekend. Chris Wallace said something that is obviously true and undeniable at this point, but it has thrown the Fox News audience into a rage. Wallace said that when Rush Limbaugh was recently interviewed on Fox News about the end of the Mueller probe, Rush Limbaugh said that the entire thing started with that phony dossier written by Christopher Steele, the British, ex-British intelligence agency. That has been repeated a bunch of times now. It's already been widely debunked. Rush Limbaugh said it. And Chris Wallace simply said, that's not true, and it has thrown Fox News viewers into a rage. Take a look.
You're exactly right. When the report comes out, because particularly on obstruction, it's not a clean bill of health. Barr ended up saying he didn't think there was a basis for prosecution. But exactly as you point out, they're going to be able to say, well, he did this or this happened. And there is only one other point I do want to make, and I know this is going to drive some of our viewers nuts. The Trump investigation did not start with the FISA warrant and Carter Page and even the dossier. It started in June and July of 2016 when George Papadopoulos had spoken to a Russian agent and spoke to an Australian diplomat and said he had heard that they had information on dirt on Hillary Clinton. That's when the investigation started. So it wasn't October. It wasn't September, it was in July, and it was George Papadopoulos. Not to say that the FISA warrant is a legitimate basis, let me just finish, not a legitimate basis for inquiry, but that is not where the investigation started. It's just a fact.
Add on all It's funny that Chris Wallace, he knows in advance that the Fox News audience is so rabid and disconnected from reality that he says he knows it's going to drive their audience nuts for him to say something so uncontroversial and obviously true. It's like he gave him a trigger warning. I'm about to tell the truth, Chris Wallace announces, and it's going to trigger the Fox News audience, the Trumpist narrative. So I'm going to warn you that I'm about to tell the truth. Wallace says the investigation actually started when Trump associates spoke to Russians about the 2016 election. That's true. And what a lot of people are missing about this entire narrative, if you didn't know that there were people claiming the whole thing started with a FISA warrant, then I envy you. I mean, I wish I didn't know that this is something people were saying. But investigations don't start with FISA warrants, right? They keep repeating this idea. But a FISA warrant is an investigative technique or a mechanism. Investigations don't start with FISA warrants. FISA warrants are issued for investigations that already stand on their own. And not surprisingly, Pat, the smears of Chris Wallace immediately starred for just telling uncontroversial truths to the audience.
And you got to love what Bill Hemmer did there, which is just to completely try to shut down Chris Wallace, make sure that what Chris Wallace had to say was not going to get out there on the airwaves. You got the sense that Bill Hemmer knew that people up at the Fox News executive offices and people watching Fox News back home, we're not going to like what Chris Wallace had to say there.
Yeah, Bill Hemmer couldn't resist. He said, and I like when Chris Wallace actually says, "Hey, let me finish this completely mild milquetoast defense of just one element of all of the crazy things that Rush Limbaugh tried to say." So this is why I question the kind of real value of these occasional voices of reason on Fox, because in the same segment, Wallace still does go along with a bunch of nonsense related to the Barr report without questioning it. But just this like one little point he questions, and Bill Hemmer doesn't like it, and the Fox News audience doesn't like it. So I guess we can say it's good in general that at least he corrected one point. But big picture, Chris Wallace is part of the apparatus, and we can't really expect any serious critique of the status quo from him or whoever else there is on Fox News. Let me know what you think. I think it's a mild net positive to have him there every once in a while saying something that's true. Hey, this is really funny. We only have 2 bumper stickers that we sell, okay? We have the David Pakman Show logo in black, and we have the David Pakman Show logo in white. If you go on our website, thedavidpakman.com/gear, those are the only 2 bumper stickers that are available. Keith contacted me over the weekend because he was driving around in Humboldt County, California, and he saw a different David Pakman Show bumper sticker, which we're going to put up on the screen for you, which says, "David Pakman 2020, Make America Tell the Truth Again." This is hilarious because someone printed this. I mean, this is not a bumper sticker that we print. I wasn't born in the United States, so I can't even be president. So I would not waste time printing such a sticker. But someone made and is driving around in Humboldt County, California, with a David Pakman 2020 bumper sticker. If you know who this person is, if you are this person, please get in touch and tell me whether you've printed hundreds or thousands of these things, or if it was just a one-off. I've actually been to Humboldt County, California. There was once one of our affiliate stations is up in Humboldt County, and it is like serious cannabis country. There are all of these, you have to hike to them to make them hard for law enforcement to reach. I mean, this was 5 years ago. Maybe the changing law has diffused this a bit, but you would see people with refrigerator-sized backpacks walking across roads, rural roads, like Highway 1 in areas where there's nothing nearby, to some of these cannabis plantations. And it's a big, it at least was a big cannabis area. And at least one person is driving around with a bumper sticker that says David Pakman 2020. So if you have more information about this, please let me know. What car is it on? Is this a single item? Who made it? And we're having all sorts of crazy things happening behind me as well with our April Fool's thing. So just to be clear, I think this is probably a sign. We have our joke Sam Cedar logo that we had on the back for April Fool's. And as soon as I'm talking about people using my likeness without permission, the logo disappears. And so I want to make it clear I have no interest in pursuing intellectual property theft lawsuits or anything like it. And this is just a curiosity, wondering where the sticker came from, and love to see it. Get in touch if you made that sticker. We have a voicemail number. It's 219-2-DAVID-P. Our voicemail line is made possible by our great friends over at Lingvist, which is an app for learning Spanish, French, German, and Russian. It quickly learns your skill level and uses artificial intelligence to speed up the language learning process. You can try it for free, no credit card required. Lingvist.com/Pakman, lingvist.com/Pakman. Okay, here's today's voicemail. Last week, I had an audience question, which was, David, make the strongest case you can against Bernie Sanders. And I even said in the segment, I am making the strongest case I can against Bernie Sanders. As many people know, he's one of my top contenders. I am merely doing what the person asked me to do. What are the strongest arguments against Bernie? And someone heard that segment and is offended that I didn't also say all the good things about Bernie. Take a listen to this voicemail.
Hey, David. This is Candy. I'm an attorney in Missouri, and I just watched your video, What's the Strongest Criticism of Bernie Sanders? I understand you doing that, but hey, why not follow it up with strongest arguments in support of Bernie? You know, why not that, too? Your advertiser not wanting to do that? Very disappointed, David. Very disappointed. Bye.
So first of all, I don't know what advertiser you're talking about, but no one has said to us, David, we will advertise on your show if and only if you say the bad things about Bernie and not the good things. That's not an advertiser we would ever accept, number one. Number two, there was not even an advertiser mentioned in that segment on the show. But more importantly, whenever we talk about the 2020 Democratic primary, I talk about all of the reasons to support Bernie Sanders and how he's one of the top 3 candidates that I'm looking at. This is, the segment was about if you had to steelman opposition to Bernie Sanders, what is it that you would say? Every other segment that we do about the 2020 primary, I talk about all of the great things about Bernie Sanders and why I would consider supporting him and voting for him. And this is where I feel people sort of get unreasonable. And then on top of this, over the weekend, someone actually canceled their paid membership because I did a segment saying, if I wanted to make the case against Bernie, what would I identify as his weaknesses? And they said they're not going to support any show that is against Bernie Sanders. And it's truly depressing. I mean, it's really, really depressing when that happens. And I've told you before that there are sort of normal reasons people cancel memberships, financial reasons, they just are kind of moving away from political shows or they're listening to other stuff or whatever, right? I mean, it's all fine. But when someone writes to me and says, David, I supported you until you went against Bernie Sanders in that segment, it's a thought experiment, okay? Someone said, David, what are the strongest arguments against Bernie Sanders' candidacy? We just want to hear what you think they are. And to interpret that as a smear, it's depressing. And whenever this happens, I kind of get bummed out. And I start questioning, like, what the hell am I doing? Are things so hair trigger that if I merely explore how I would argue against a Bernie candidacy, people are pulling financial support? Just disappointing, I guess. I don't know what other word to assign to it. We've got a great bonus show for you today for people who still are members and haven't angrily canceled because I considered how I might argue against a Bernie Sanders candidacy. The White House is working on healthcare plans with 3 conservative think tanks. We'll talk about that. We have a sort of string of minor injuries and blocked sidewalks that are now becoming a real nuisance as a result of the prevalence of electric scooters around the country. And I also want to tell you about the Colorado sheriff who's willing to go to jail rather than enforce a gun law that has been proposed. All of those stories and more on today's bonus show. Become a member, become a patron to get instant access, and I'll speak to you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.